Right. I want to take a few minutes to talk about a topic that is, I don't want to say controversial. It's just a topic that people really don't like much because it is sometimes confusing and frustrating because, well, it just is. We're going to talk about manuals and parts catalogs. And really, the biggest piece of frustration that I think comes from this is the fact that different manufacturers have different ways of organizing manuals and presenting information, and it just gets frustrating. You have to figure out what they're doing, and then you can understand a little bit better how to navigate the system that they've created, no matter how terrible and nefarious it is. So, we're going to start for a couple minutes. I want to show you a few different things to watch out for as you try to work on today's assignment and hopefully give you an idea a little bit better for how to navigate some of these manuals. So we're going to be looking at two Continental manuals that you'll be using for your assignment, the 0470 Overhaul Manual and Parts Catalog. We're starting with the Overhaul Manual, and I've put us here on the table of contents. Now, with the table of contents, you'll notice a couple different things. It's broken into different sections, and it's done so under different motives, I guess you'd call it, or different operations. So, for instance, chapter one is the introduction to the manual and the engine. It tells you everything you need to know to be able to move forward. So, what are replacement parts that must be replaced on every overhaul? Information about service bulletins. This one is pretty useful. Definitions and abbreviations. It tells you all the different abbreviations they'll be using within the manual, and it does differ slightly from manufacturer to manufacturer. So it's important to take a look and make sure you know what they're talking about. Or if you just dive right in, remember that you do have a definition section at the front. So if they use a term that doesn't make any sense to you, well, pop back and see what it has to say. Then you might have an idea of what's going on. We have lists of special tools, so on and so forth. What we're really going to dive into here is the actual operational overhaul portions. So we get different sections that cover different kinds of practices. We have information that covers our different inspections and what should be on that for this particular model of engine. We have standard practices for maintenance operations on the engine. And then we get further into what we call the description and operation. So, chapter 72, engine reciprocating, that is talking about the description and operation of each system, each major system on this engine. So, as we're trying to tear apart an engine for overhaul, as we're evaluating things, if we need to know how that system works, and it is helpful to know how it works, whether it's troubleshooting or trying to figure out what's going on, why it won't come apart, that gives us most of our background information. As we take a look into 72-10, this is the step-by-step disassembly of that engine. It's designed to effectively be a checklist, so you start at the first portion of this chapter and work all the way through until the engine has been completely disassembled. Further down, we have cleaning, repair, and replacement, which is going to cover the actual physical cleaning of the engine for overhaul, repairing anything that needs to be repaired, and replacing any parts that require it. And then we follow up with inspection. There's a number of areas that need to be inspected on the engine, and that's where we're going to cover that as well. Now, there's two things I want to point out here. We have specific inspections, which are what might be referred to as special inspections with other engine manufacturers, and these are very specific procedures that are used on specific parts, while the inspection section talks a little more about general procedures or materials being used. The specific inspection tells you how to inspect the crankshaft, how to inspect the cylinders, how to inspect you get the idea. A little bit further down, and this is one that is extremely helpful to us, we have our final assembly, which is kind of the reverse of our disassembly section, our testing section after the engine's been overhauled, and then we have a few extra sections to talk about our general troubleshooting, general system issues after the engine's been put back together and we're trying to operate it. Now, the one I want to point out here is towards the end of our inspection section, and I'll scroll down here real fast, see if I can find it. We are almost there. All right. So as a part of our inspection section, we have what we call the table of limits, or limits and operating clearances. So whenever we inspect an engine, every component within the engine is going to need to conform to a specific set of measurements. If we're talking about the size of a part, for instance, we would be referring to its dimension. If we're talking about the space between two parts, let's say between the main crankshaft bearings and the main crankshaft journals, we would refer to that as clearances. So our table of limits gives us all of the numerical information we need to be able to figure out by measuring very precisely if the engine does indeed conform. And as we pop down here, the thing I want to point out is that not every single measurement was for every single submodel of engine. You're asking yourself, what do you mean by submodel? Well, in this case, this entire manual covers the Continental 0470 series. However, there's a great number of 0470s that range from dash A to dash TU, something like that. Those are all different submodels and they have slight variations in the parts that they use. So the important thing is to make sure that when we do identify a measurement in our table of limits, that we are going to connect that with the correct engine. The way that Lycoming does this is even more complicated, and we'll probably end up talking about that in lab. But it is important to make sure that you're looking at the correct submodel for the engine that you are going to be assessing. Now, I want to take one more second to pop into our parts catalog and show you something along the same lines. Now, the parts catalog is organized very similarly. We have an introduction to the engine. We have the abbreviations and symbols that are going to be used within this manual. We also have information about oversized and undersized parts, and we have the entire engine broken down into different subsections. Now, what I want to show you is we jump into one of these subsections. That seems good enough. The way that this is organized, the way that Continental does this, is you have a image or a figure with a bunch of numbers that are attached to it that point out specific components of this assembly. And you can see that they're all listed here under the figure. So this is figure 72-10-04, which is right here, 72-10-04. And then we have the dash numbers are all of those subcomponents in that assembly. Now, the thing that gets a little bit screwy is you'll notice here we have two -7s. The reason for that being is we have two different part numbers, and that's because we have two different potential parts depending on the model of engine. So these letters up here indicate the submodel of 0470 that we're looking at. A, B, E, G, J, K, L, M, you get the idea. In most cases, we're looking at the R model. That's what we happen to have in our hangar for the most part. Now, here's the bit. As you're trying to determine what part is correct for that engine, you're going to need to find your submodel up here and then come down and see where it shows the number for that part. So in this case, we're looking at the two different -7s. You'll notice that all of these models have a number 1 in their column for this part number, the 640620-9, which is an oil filler cap. The only one that's different is the G submodel, which has a different part number for its oil filler cap. That's the 640620-4. That's a lot of numbers, and it does not seem like it is a big difference, but it makes all the difference in the world because not only may a part from another model not work on our engine, in order for this engine to be legal, and you may remember this from CFRs, in order for an engine to be legal, it must conform to its type certificate. And part of that type certification process is the parts manual, the overhaul manual, that dictates everything that should be installed on that engine. So if we change one part for another that doesn't belong to that engine, even something as little as the filler cap for the oil, then it no longer conforms to the type certificate. Legally speaking, we can't fly that engine. So that's an important distinction to make. That's the quick overview of this. Take your time with this project. There's not a lot going else while we're working on this project. So take your time, try to get really familiar with the manuals as you finish this assignment because it's really going to help you when we get back into lab and we start working on actual engines.